the starting point is actually 650. So in 650, Cherson was a Byzantine provincial center of administration, church, trade, and crafts, earning money by producing, for example, and selling, for example, metal objects, garden, or exporting salt. In the administrative system of the Byzantine Empire, Cherson was under the leadership of a dux. That is attested for the first time at the building inscription of Justin and Sophia after the Turks sacked Bospor in 576-77 and even appeared at Cherson at 579. The area under the leadership of the dukes was enlarged and included also Bospor, which is evidenced by another building inscription found at the Taman Peninsula, which comes from 590. As for the neighbors of Cherson, these were the Alans and the Goths living in the fortresses in the Crimean mountains, not very far from Cherson. These fortresses were built by the Byzantines at the end of the 6th century, most likely as a reaction to the previously mentioned attack of the Turks in the Crimea. It seems that the dukes of Cherson firmly worked until the arrival of the Khazars, which is after the mid-7th century. The Khazars were one of the Turkic tribes whose power gradually increased, and they expanded from the steppes at the Caspian Sea to the west as far as to the Pontic steppes and the Crimea, where there in 670s became the main military power. Written sources on the Khazars and Crimea are scarce, but there is archaeology helping us to find traces on their presence. The Khazars and the groups of various tribes that were subordinated to the Khazars were connected by Salto-Marki material culture. And this material is different from the Byzantine one. And it is quite uniform and quite easily recognizable. Here is an example. As for Crimea, the amount of finds of this culture from the second half of the 7th and first half of the 8th century is not high. The Khazars did not settle down in great numbers at Crimea at that time, especially in the western part of the peninsula, but they took control of the Crimean territory, especially the eastern part, which the Byzantine Empire no longer had the power to or the strength to influence. It is not entirely clear what the status of the fortresses of the Goths and Alans were. They always had a strong connection to Byzantium through Cherson. However, with the fading Byzantine power in the Crimea, it was probable that the inhabitants of the fortresses and their surroundings at a certain time recognized the Khazars as their rulers. The Khazars controlled their dependent non-Turkic territories through governors. If trustworthy, the territories could retain their autonomy. In that case, the Khazars left the administration in the hands of the local government, but appointed an official on the top of the administrative pyramid. This official, the Tudun, was the direct representative of the Khagan, supervising the territory and, in particular, collecting taxes for the family. Regarding the 7th century, quite a fair connection of Cherson to Constantinople is indicated by several things as working coinage. Copper follets were struck in Cherson during the Emperor Heraclius' reign, or sending important persons to exile to Cherson, as were, for example, Pope Martin in 655 others, and furthermore by fines of seals. I have here interesting examples of seals of Commerciarioi. In the last quarter of the 7th century, the situation became much more complicated. Byzantium, fighting the Arabs, the Slavs, and the Bulgars in the Mediterranean, was in a complicated situation and had to accept the Khazarian dominance over the Crimea. On the other hand, Byzantium also wanted to influence the life and administration of the Byzantine cities on the peninsula, whence it was possible to watch dangerous steppe peoples and to control trade between East Europe and Asia. The Byzantine long-time strategy was to master Cherson and the southeastern Crimean coast. southwestern Crimean. Cherson, however, tended to assert its autonomy time to time. In addition, also other peoples wanted to settle down in the Crimea. Unlike the Caucasus, where the Byzantines and the Khazars had the common enemy, the Arabs, the Crimea was a territory where both empires had common interests. This idea, together with an interesting fact that the Khazars and the Byzantines only rarely fought each other, led the scholars to the hypothesis of the shared rule in the Crimea, which was called a condominium, that there was created a condominium. This form of administration was well known in Byzantium because it was used in frontier contact zones of the empire, for example in Cyprus or in Caucasian Albania. It was suggested that such an agreement between the Khazars and the Byzantines pertaining to the Crimea could have been concluded already in the first period of the reign of Justinian II. And the reason is because just after 685, so soon after Justinian ascended the throne, he concluded an agreement with the Arab ruler Abdul Malik, in which, except other, it was arranged that revenues from Cyprus, Armenia, and Iberia would be shared between the two empires. Unfortunately, there is no direct evidence of the existence of condominium in Crimea, at least I'm aware of. Only indirect signs, as excluding occasional disturbances, the territory was in general peaceful and prospered. So indirect signs led scholars to the establishment of this theory and the conditions under which the condominium performed. For the status of Cherson in the given period, I mean between the end of the 7th century and 840, 5 possibilities can be considered. So Cherson was a regular part of the Byzantine Empire, or there was self-government with a strong connection to Byzantium, or full autonomy, or self-government under supervision of a Tudor, meaning dependence on the Khazars, or the condominium shared governance of the Khazars and Byzantium. Municipal self-government worked in Cherson from antiquity during the years that followed. However, when the territory became Byzantine, it was controlled by the Byzantine officials and officers, for example, the dukes I mentioned. If we try to clarify the situation, we need to have a look at the events that have happened in the Crimea more closely. In the first part of Justinian II's reign, Cherson was one of the segments of the Byzantine Empire. Justinian II's life story is well known, so just in short, he was deposed in 695, his nose was cut so that he could not become the emperor again, and he was banished to Cherson. Despite his mutilation, Justinian was eager to become emperor again, which alarmed the citizens of Cherson who wanted to report it to Constantinople. Justinian, therefore, in 702, fled from Cherson to the neighboring territory of the Crimean Goths, where he got in touch with the Khagan of the Khazars, and consequently he was married to a Khagan's relative, sister and daughter. Then Byzantium objected to such behavior to the Khazars, and Justinian had to flee again to the Khazar territory. And according to primary sources, with the help of several people from Cherson, this time he fled likely to the estuary of Danube, and then in 705 he regained the Byzantine throne with the help of the Bulgars. It therefore seems that during the Justinian stay in Cherson, the town itself was under Byzantine control, while beyond its borders, the territories were under the control of the Khazars, because having escaped from Cherson, Justinian got out of reach of Byzantium, and he easily made contact not only with Khazars, but with Khagan himself. On the other hand, the fact that, according to the sources, several citizens of Cherson helped Justinian escape shows that at least some people of Cherson might have tended to be autonomous or even to side with the Khazars. Back on the throne, Justinian, among other things, got involved in a turmoil in Ravenna, Italy, when in 708 the newly elected Bishop Felix denied obeying the Pope, an act supported by nobility of Ravenna. Justinian, in the meantime, managed to establish friendly relations with the Pope, and he intervened in the controversy between Ravenna and Rome by sending imperial troops from Sicily against Ravenna. Agnellus, the chronicle of the Church of Ravenna, described this violent act as Justinian as a revenge to the Ravenians. Justinian reportedly believed that several people from Ravenna had previously taken part in Justinian's deposition and mutilation, specifically in a rhinocopia, the nose cutting. The nobility of Ravenna, including Felix, was arrested and transported to Constantinople. While the noblemen were sentenced to death by Justinian, Felix's life was spared. Nonetheless, he was blinded and sent to exile to Pontus, from where he could return as late as after Justinian's death. He went back to Ravenna and died there in 723. The most plausible place of Felix's exile is Cherson, which means that in 708, Cherson must have been considered as a place loyal to the emperor. Then, the year 711, it was a very busy year for Justinian, because from the autumn 710, Pope Constantine was visiting Constantinople to discuss the controversial articles of the Quidditch Council and stayed there until October 711. In the meantime, Justinian tried to solve a difficult situation in Crimea. According to primary sources, he sent naval expeditions against Cherson because reportedly he wanted to take revenge on the town in which he suffered and which betrayed him. Here, the motive of revenge appears again, and that time at Xenophon's and Nicephorus, the chronicles. But it seems much more likely that by sending military troops both to Ravenna and to Cherson, Justinian tried to suppress a rebellion. The case of Ravenna is quite clear: the disobedience to the Pope and autonomous tendencies of Ravenna in general. In Cherson, the situation and probably dissatisfaction with the emperor went so far that the Cherson municipal government could have gone to the other side and submitted to the Khazars. It is possible that for a short period of time, which means not before 708 when Felix was sent there, and until the naval expeditions in 711, Cherson, out of its own decision, ceased to be a part of the Byzantine Empire and happened to be an autonomous territory. It held its municipal self-government, but under the control of a Khazar official, the Tudun, whose presence in Cherson is evident, even though rather only for a short time. The attempts of Cherson to get more independence were dangerous for the northern border defense of the Byzantine Empire. For its security, the obedience of Cherson was essential. Thus, Justinian's expedition against Cherson could have been caused mainly by the growing tendencies towards autonomy and losing influence on the area of Cherson than by revenge, and likewise by the effort to reattach the Crimean territory to the empire. We know that even though the Justinian's army damaged a part of wall of Cherson, he personally failed, because the Khazar Khagan interfered and the conflict was immediately terminated. A new emperor was chosen in Cherson. It was Philippikos Bardanes, likely the commander of the punitive expedition against Cherson, and perhaps also former expellee in Cherson. Justinian sent one more expedition to the Crimea, but its members, fed up with Justinian's behavior, joined the revolt. Philippikos Bardanes then left Cherson for Constantinople, and Justinian killed and seized the throne. I said that Justinian personally failed. However, if his intention truly was to get Cherson back under the Byzantine control, then he succeeded, because it is likely that Cherson, after supporting Philippikos Bardanes against Justinian, stabilized the relation with Constantinople. This is perhaps the time to which we can trace the very beginnings of administrative unit of Archontia in Cherson. Nicephorus and Theophanes speak about Archontias and Archontes already when describing the Justinian's punitive expeditions to Crimea at the beginning of the 8th century. Furthermore, archaeological evidence of seals of archons confirm their presence in Cherson. I found quite an early example. Perhaps the earliest example, the seal of Theodotos, Hippatos, Imperius Patriot Candidate, and Icon of Cherson. There are two examples of it, one of them quite damaged, and it's from the first half of the 8th century. However, much more common are the seals of icons from the second half of the 8th century and first half of the 9th century, when Byzantine Empire made efforts to strengthen its influence in the Crimean. In 787, there was a rebellion in the territory of the Crimean Goths, which likely had the status of an autonomous territory under the control of the Khazars. The rebellion is known as the uprising of John the Bishop of Gothia. Even under the Khazar control, Christian Byzantine eparchies in the Crimea worked on. The uprising was limited only to the Gothic capital of Toros, and while it was not supported by local inhabitants, it was most likely endorsed by the Byzantines, who saw it as an opportunity to weaken the Khazarian dominance in the Crimea. The consequences were unpleasant for the Byzantine Empire. The rebellion was suppressed by the Khazarian army, John was imprisoned, Gothia lost its autonomy, and the Crimean mountains got under the direct control of Khazaria through Erdogan. Khazarian garrison was placed in Gothia, and such movements of the Khazarian army on the threshold of Cherson forced the Byzantine government to act and to try to increase Byzantine influence in Cherson, which led to the changes in municipal administration and to strengthen of the Archontia. Being the Archontia, Cherson might have a certain autonomy in like municipal self-government, but it was dependent on the Byzantine. Also, Gothia was an Archontia, however, its Archon was appointed by the Khazar Khagan as his representative in Gothia. I will shortly return to the question of the condominium. Under the control of the Khazars, but with the Byzantines firmly settled in various parts of the peninsula, Crimea could enjoy periods of peace, which resulted in development, agriculture, and trade. Here comes again the idea of an agreement between both the Byzantines and the Khazars. However, how could such an agreement have looked like precisely simply remains unknown. Only from the indirect evidence, as is the peace, the absence of army on both sides in Crimea, the mutual trade contacts, and the existence of condominium elsewhere, can we think of that such an agreement existed and that certain conditions were negotiated. For example, the condition of demilitarization, reciprocal free trade, and so on. Even though it was suggested that power in condominium could have been divided among a municipal council, a Khazar governor, and a Byzantine archon with the seat in Cherson, I personally would not connect the condominium with the municipal administration, because to me it seems as something that worked independently on these occasional skirmishes or misunderstandings. In any case, the cooperation between the Khazars and the Byzantines had a lot of levels and culminated before the mid-9th century, when they joined to defend the ever restless northern border from the attacks of the Magyars and the Pechenegs, who at the beginning of the 9th century started to exert pressure on the Khazars and even raided the Middle Crimea. Except for them, also the Rus extended their power at Middle Dnieper and were able to threaten both the Khazars and the Byzantines. Thus, in 838, a delegation sent by the Khazar Khagan arrived in Constantinople, requesting help in building a fortress at the low reaches of the river Don with the purpose of watching the steppes and defending the territory. As Byzantium would have profited from the existence of such a fortress, this request was accepted and an expedition under the leadership of Petronas Timotheus was sent to the river Don. The itinerary of the journey followed the known northern branch of the commercial route to the east, from Constantinople to Sinope, across the Black Sea to Cherson, where the expedition changed boats for small ones more suitable for navigating rivers. Through the Azov Sea, the expedition reached the River Don and got to the right place probably in summer 840. There was an old ruined fortress of white stone, instead of which the Byzantines built a new fortification called Circle, and the expedition immediately returned along the same way. Back in Constantinople, Petronas Kamateras reported to Emperor Theophilos about the untrustworthiness of the municipal government of Cherson, which likely once again showed signs of self-government or even tendencies towards autonomy. This time, the situation in the Byzantine Empire was consolidated, and the emperor had the power and means to strengthen the Byzantine position in Crimea. It was therefore decided about uniting the Byzantine possessions in Crimea and creating the theme of Cherson, which must have happened before the Emperor Theophilos died in January 842. A theme was always led by a strategos, an imperial official, who was appointed by the emperor and who was accompanied by military troops. In such a way, the emperor tried to enlist the obedience of Cherson. The emergence of the theme was also possible because the Khazarian power over the northern steppes was continually diminishing due to increasing power of the Magyars, the Pechenegs, and the Rus. The Byzantines were most likely able to take over the control of Gothia again, even though only for a short time, while the rest of the Crimea was further controlled by the Khazars. Crimean fortresses were reconstructed by the Byzantines after the mid-9th century, as were the walls of Cherson, previously damaged by Justinian II's troops. The reconstruction of the fortresses was undoubtedly related to the pressure exerted by the Magyars, who raided Middle Crimea already in 830s, and after the mid-9th century they overpowered the Khazars in the eastern Crimea. They skirmishes that continued until they were overpowered by the Pechenegs at the end of the 9th century hit the whole Crimea, including the Gothic fortresses and Bospor, while Cherson with its walls was impregnable for the Normans. I cannot finish my paper without mentioning one of the most favorite topics of Vladimir Vechtinek, which is Saint Constantine the philosopher in Cherson. Constantine, on his diplomatic mission to the Khazars, spent in Cherson winter 861, found relics of St. Clement the Pope there, and in his life, Cherson was described as a town surrounded by pagans. That time, the Byzantine territory in the Crimea seemed to be limited to Cherson itself again. Thank you.